Story 1. The Haunted Claw Machine. Tim was a regular at the old arcade down by the pier. It had been there since the late 1980s, its carpets worn and its machines a bit outdated. But it had a certain charm that drew people in. The claw machine by the entrance had always caught his eye, mainly because the prizes inside seemed out of place. Dusty, ragged-looking dolls, much older than the usual brightly colored toys you'd expect. Their eyes, dark, glassy, and lifeless, gave Tim an odd feeling every time he passed by. One evening, after a long day at work, Tim decided to give the claw machine a try. He'd avoided it in the past, but curiosity got the better of him. He inserted his coins and maneuvered the claw, gripping one of the dolls in its metallic grasp. For a second, it felt like the claw was struggling, like the doll was resisting. But with a satisfying clunk, the doll dropped into the prize slot. Tim reached in to grab it, only to pull his hand back in shock. The doll's body felt unnaturally cold, not the kind of cold that you'd expect from an old, abandoned toy. This was an icy, bone-chilling cold. He hesitated but finally picked it up, cradling the doll in his hands. As he walked away, Tim swore he heard a faint whisper, something that sent a shiver up his spine. He looked around, but the arcade was nearly empty, save for a couple of kids playing skee-ball at the back. He hurried home, trying to shake off the weird feeling, but that night he had trouble sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard faint, disembodied whispers. They grew louder, more persistent, until he could almost make out words, something like, "Let me go," or "I need to leave." The next day, feeling unnerved, Tim decided to get rid of the doll. He tossed it in the dumpster behind his apartment complex and thought that would be the end of it. But that evening, as he returned to his apartment, the doll was sitting on his doorstep, its eyes now looking directly at him. His heart dropped into his stomach. There was no way someone could have retrieved the doll from the dumpster, let alone know where he lived. Panicking, Tim grabbed the doll and decided to return it to the arcade. He rushed inside, heading straight for the claw machine, where he was met by the sight of the arcade's owner. "Back so soon?" the owner asked with a strange grin. Tim, out of breath, thrust the doll toward him and explained what had happened. The owner's grin faded as he studied the doll. "You're not the first one," he muttered, taking the doll from Tim's hands. "This machine's been here for decades, and every few years someone comes in with a story like yours. Whatever's in these dolls, it doesn't like to leave." Tim never went back to that arcade, and as far as he knows, the dolls are still there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to come along. Story 2. The Forgotten Arcade Room. In the late 1990s, Danny and his friends were frequent visitors of the now-closed Galactic Funhouse, an arcade nestled in a suburban mall. The place had an odd layout. Maze-like hallways connected the main arcade to various sections, including a dimly lit snack bar and a couple of small, unused rooms. One night, Danny's group had the arcade nearly to themselves. The air buzzed with the sounds of clashing swords from a fighting game and the endless pings of pinball machines. As they wandered the arcade, Danny spotted a hallway that he'd never noticed before, its lights flickering intermittently. Intrigued, Danny called his friends over. "Hey, have you guys seen this before?" he asked. His friends shook their heads. The hallway looked older than the rest of the arcade, like it had been forgotten for years. Despite their better judgment, they decided to explore it. At the end of the hallway, they found a door. It looked out of place, as if it belonged to a different building entirely. With some effort, they pushed it open. Inside was a small room, dusty and lined with outdated arcade machines, ones that none of them had ever seen before. The room felt cold, far colder than it should have been, given that the rest of the arcade was sweltering from all the machines running. Danny and his friends were drawn to the machines, though something about them felt wrong. One of the games, titled Devil's Run, had no graphics on the screen, just static. Yet, when Danny pressed the buttons, the machine flickered to life. The game started playing itself, as if it had a mind of its own. In it, a shadowy figure ran down a road lined with graves, chased by some unseen force. Then, something strange happened. The figure on the screen stopped running, turned, and seemed to look directly at Danny. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits. A text box appeared at the bottom of the screen. "I see you." Danny's heart raced, and he pulled away from the machine, but the game kept going. His friends, who had been playing other machines, suddenly stopped, their faces pale. "Turn it off!" one of them whispered, but the machine wouldn't respond to any button presses. In a panic, they all rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind them. They didn't go back to the arcade for a few days, but when they finally did, they tried to find the hallway again. It was gone. They asked one of the employees about the strange room, but he looked at them like they were crazy. "There's no room back there," he insisted. Galactic Funhouse closed down not long after, and Danny never found out what that arcade room was or why the game seemed so sentient. All he knew was that something in that room wasn't meant to be found. Story 3. The Man in the Reflection. Samantha was a part-time employee at a local arcade in her small town. It wasn't a glamorous job, but she enjoyed it, especially during the late-night shifts when the place was practically empty. One evening, she noticed something strange while cleaning the mirrored walls near the back of the arcade. As she wiped the mirrors, something caught her eye. It wasn't her own reflection staring back at her. Behind her, there appeared to be a man, tall and dressed in an old-fashioned black suit. Samantha froze. Slowly she turned around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the arcade was empty. Her heart pounded as she glanced back at the mirror. The man was still there, his expression blank, his eyes black holes where pupils should be. Samantha blinked, but the man didn't disappear. Instead, he seemed to move closer, though she never saw him take a step. His reflection loomed just inches behind hers, but when she whipped around, there was still no one there. Samantha left the arcade early that night, convinced that exhaustion had gotten the better of her. But over the next few weeks, the man in the mirror continued to appear. Sometimes he stood further back. Sometimes he seemed almost close enough to reach out and touch her. No one else saw him, and as much as Samantha wanted to believe it was her imagination, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her from beyond the glass. One night, after locking up, she went to check her reflection one last time. The man was there again, closer than ever before, his face now twisted into a grotesque smile. Samantha gasped and turned to leave, but as she did, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. There was no one behind her. She quit her job the next day. Years later, Samantha still refuses to look in mirrors after dark, just in case the man is still watching. Story 1. The Cabin in the Catskills. In 2014, Angela and her boyfriend, Ethan, decided to spend a romantic weekend in a secluded cabin in the Catskills, about a 2-hour drive from New York City. It was late October, and the couple thought the idea of being surrounded by fall foliage would be a perfect way to spend the weekend. They rented a cabin on Airbnb, owned by a couple who lived nearby. The listing boasted complete privacy and serenity, which sounded ideal to them. When they arrived, the first thing Angela noticed was how quiet it was, almost too quiet. There were no other houses or cabins in sight, just dense woods that stretched out endlessly. The cabin itself was rustic but charming. However, something about the place felt off. Ethan brushed off her unease, saying it was just her city nerves reacting to the silence. That night, as they settled in, Angela kept hearing noises outside. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but every time she looked out the window, there was nothing. Ethan tried to calm her down, saying it was probably just wildlife. Raccoons, maybe a deer or two. Around midnight, they were both startled by a loud bang on the cabin's front door. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and peeked outside, but there was no one there. Maybe a branch fell, they thought, and tried to go back to sleep, but soon after they heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate steps. Angela, now fully terrified, whispered that they should call the police, but Ethan didn't want to overreact. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin, getting louder and closer. The sound of what seemed like scratching on the walls made their blood run cold. Finally, they couldn't take it anymore. Ethan called the local sheriff's office while Angela hid in the bedroom, clutching a knife. When the police arrived an hour later, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. The officers suggested it might have been a bear, but Angela wasn't convinced. She swore she had heard human footsteps, not an animal. They packed up and left the cabin in the early hours of the morning, cutting their weekend getaway short. A week later, the owner of the cabin reached out to apologize, explaining that the cabin had a history of strange occurrences. Previous renters had reported the same sounds, and a few even claimed to see shadowy figures around the property. The owner assured them it was nothing more than local superstition. Angela never went back. Story 2. The Haunted Bed and Breakfast in New Orleans. In the summer of 2017, Lily and her two best friends, Tessa and Mark, decided to visit New Orleans for a weekend. They had heard great things about the city's rich history, vibrant culture, and, of course, its haunted reputation. Rather than staying in a chain hotel, they chose a small bed and breakfast located just outside the French Quarter. The B&B was known for its Victorian charm, but what they didn't know was that it had a dark past. The owner, a sweet elderly woman named Miss Rose, greeted them warmly and told them stories about how the house had been in her family for generations. She even hinted at the ghostly activity that guests sometimes experienced, but Lily and her friends shrugged it off as part of the city's charm. After all, New Orleans was famous for its haunted tales. Their first night, everything seemed normal. They spent the day exploring the French Quarter and indulging in Creole cuisine. But when they returned to their room, strange things started happening. Around 2 a.m., Mark woke up to the sound of soft crying. At first, he thought it was one of the girls, but when he looked over, both were fast asleep. The crying grew louder, as if it were coming from the hallway. Mark, half asleep, opened the door to find nothing. The hallway was empty, but the crying persisted. The next morning, he told Lily and Tessa about the strange experience, but they laughed it off. That night, however, things escalated. Around midnight, all three were awoken by the sound of footsteps running up and down the stairs outside their room. Lily checked her phone. There was no one else staying in the B&B, and Miss Rose's room was downstairs. The sound was unmistakable, and it was getting louder. Tessa, curious and a bit braver than the rest, opened the door to investigate, but the second she did, the footsteps stopped. She closed the door and returned to bed, but as soon as she lay down, the footsteps resumed, this time accompanied by the sound of a door creaking open and slamming shut repeatedly. The final straw came on their last night. Lily woke up in the early hours of the morning to a figure standing at the foot of her bed. A woman in a white nightgown, her face shadowed but her presence icy and cold. Lily froze in terror. The figure stared at her for what felt like an eternity before disappearing into thin air. Shaken, the group packed up and left early that morning. Before they left, Miss Rose confided that many guests had reported similar experiences. She believed the spirit of her great aunt, who had died under mysterious circumstances in the house, was still lingering. The friends never returned to New Orleans after that trip. Story 3. The Lake House Mystery. In 2019, James and his girlfriend Sarah joined a group of friends for a weekend getaway at a lake house in rural Pennsylvania. The house belonged to a family friend and was perched on a remote part of the lake, surrounded by dense woods. The group of 6 planned to spend the weekend swimming, barbecuing, and enjoying each other's company. But from the moment they arrived, things didn't feel right. On their first evening, as they sat around the campfire, James noticed strange lights in the woods across the lake. At first, they thought it might be other campers or fishermen, but the lights were erratic, zigzagging through the trees at unnatural speeds. Sarah joked that maybe it was just fireflies, but the lights were too bright and too large for that. Later that night, while everyone else was asleep, James got up to use the bathroom. As he looked out the window, he saw the same lights hovering above the trees, slowly making their way toward the house. His heart raced, but he told himself it was just his imagination. He crawled back into bed, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in his gut. The next day they went out on the lake. As they swam and floated on inflatable tubes, one of their friends, Ben, noticed something strange in the water. A dark, shadowy figure about 20 feet away was lurking beneath the surface. At first, they thought it might be a large fish or some debris, but as they watched, the shape grew larger, coming closer to their group. Ben, unnerved, swam back to the boat, and the rest quickly followed. That night, James couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., he heard what sounded like whispers outside the bedroom window. At first, he thought it was Sarah talking in her sleep, but when he listened closely, he realized the whispers were coming from outside. He tiptoed to the window and peered out into the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, he saw the lights again. Closer this time. Panicking, he woke Sarah, and they decided to leave early. As they packed their bags in the middle of the night, they heard footsteps on the gravel outside, followed by a loud bang on the front door. The group froze, paralyzed with fear. They grabbed their things and bolted to the car without looking back. Once safely home, they learned that the area around the lake had a long history of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena. Locals referred to it as a hot spot for paranormal activity, but no one had ever been able to explain what was really going on in those woods. James and Sarah haven't been back to the lake house since, and the eerie lights still haunt their dreams. Story 1. The Midnight Special. It was the kind of diner you'd expect to see in a horror movie. A flickering neon sign, peeling red vinyl booths, and a single waitress juggling coffee pots and plates of pancakes. But at the Midnight Special diner, something far more sinister lurked beneath the surface. Mark and Cindy were driving through rural Pennsylvania late one foggy night, making their way to a family reunion in a remote cabin. Exhausted and hungry, they saw the diner's sign shining faintly through the mist, like a beacon of hope. Despite its rundown appearance, they decided to stop. As they entered, the bells above the door gave a metallic jingle. The air inside was stale and had a greasy smell to it. Only a few customers occupied the booths, silent figures who barely glanced up from their plates. An old jukebox in the corner played some song from the 60s, but it kept skipping, repeating the same eerie refrain. "You're never going to leave." It was faint, but just loud enough to make you uncomfortable if you paid attention. Mark nudged Cindy, and they chose a booth near the back, away from the others. The waitress, a gaunt woman with dark circles under her eyes and a strange, too-wide smile, approached them. "What'll it be, folks?" she asked, her voice raspy, as if she hadn't spoken in days. Mark glanced at the laminated, grease-stained menu. I'll have the cheeseburger, fries, and a coffee." "I'll just take a milkshake," Cindy added, suddenly feeling a chill crawl up her spine. The waitress scribbled their order, her smile never faltering, then shuffled back toward the kitchen. Mark and Cindy settled into their booth, trying to ignore the strange atmosphere. But something felt off. The other diners sat too still, as though frozen in time. And that song, it was still skipping, endlessly repeating. After what felt like an eternity, the waitress returned with their food. Mark's burger looked greasy but edible, and Cindy's milkshake had a peculiar greenish tint. She hesitated before taking a sip, instantly regretting it. It tasted metallic, bitter, like spoiled milk mixed with something foul. Suddenly Mark coughed violently, clutching his throat. He had barely bitten into his burger before turning pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong," he gasped. Before Cindy could react, the lights in the diner flickered. The customers at the other booths turned toward them, their faces expressionless. One by one, they stood up, moving in unison toward Mark and Cindy. Their steps were unnaturally slow, their eyes vacant. Panicking, Cindy jumped to her feet, trying to drag Mark out of the booth. "We need to leave, now!" she screamed. But Mark was convulsing, his face contorted in pain, as if something inside him was tearing him apart. The waitress appeared again, holding the coffee pot in one hand. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her smile stretching impossibly wide. "No one ever leaves the midnight special." The walls of the diner seemed to close in, the windows clouding over with condensation. Cindy frantically pulled Mark to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The customers were closing in, their movements mechanical, their skin graying as they got closer. Just as Cindy was about to scream, everything stopped. The next thing she knew, she was in the passenger seat of their car. Mark sat beside her, driving down the highway as though nothing had happened. Her heart raced as she looked around, disoriented. Had it all been a nightmare? But then she glanced at the clock on the dashboard. They'd left for the diner at 11:30 p.m. The clock now read 3 a.m. They hadn't been inside for more than 20 minutes. Had they? Mark noticed her staring and asked, "What's wrong?" Cindy's blood ran cold. His voice was calm, too calm, and his eyes, they weren't his anymore. "Nothing," she whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched the seatbelt. They never spoke about that night again, but Cindy knew, deep down, that she hadn't left the diner alone. Story 2. The Man at Table 5. Doris had worked the graveyard shift at Murphy's Diner for nearly 20 years. It was a simple, old-fashioned place, open 24/7 to serve truckers, night owls, and the occasional passer-by. Nothing much ever happened at Murphy's, except for the time when the man at Table 5 came in. It was a Tuesday night, sometime around 3 a.m., when Doris first saw him. He sat at Table 5, his back to the door, facing the window that looked out into the parking lot. He was dressed in an old tattered suit, the kind that looked like it had seen better days decades ago. His hair was slicked back, his skin unnervingly pale. Something about him felt off. Doris approached, her coffee pot in hand. "What can I get you, hun?" The man didn't look up. His voice was low, barely a whisper. "Just coffee." Doris nodded and poured him a cup, though the way he stared out the window made her uneasy. He didn't move, didn't even acknowledge her when she placed the cup down. She returned to the counter and watched him from a distance. He didn't touch the coffee, just sat there, staring. Hours passed. By the time her shift was nearing its end, the diner had emptied out, leaving her and the man at Table 5 alone. That's when she noticed something strange. His reflection in the window. It wasn't there. She blinked, rubbing her eyes, convinced she was tired. But no, the window was clear, the parking lot visible through the glass, but there was no reflection of the man sitting there. Doris's heart raced. She approached the table cautiously. "Excuse me, sir, but are you okay?" This time the man turned to face her, and what she saw made her gasp. His eyes were sunken, his skin stretched tight over his bones, and his mouth curved into a twisted grin. "Tell me, Doris," he said, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Do you ever wonder what's on the other side?" She stepped back, her hand trembling. What do you mean?" "Death," he whispered. "It's not so bad." The room grew colder. Doris could see her breath as the man stood up. His movement was slow, deliberate, as though his body resisted every step. "I've been waiting," he said, walking toward the door. "And now it's your turn." Before Doris could react, he vanished, disappearing into the air as though he had never been there at all. But the chill lingered, and when Doris glanced back at Table 5, the coffee cup was full of dust. She never saw the man again, but after that night, strange things began happening at Murphy's. Lights flickered, strange noises echoed through the halls, and customers would complain of feeling watched. Doris eventually quit her job, but the memory of the man at Table 5 haunted her. To this day, no one sits at that table without feeling a chill creep up their spine. Story 3. The Close Sign. Frank owned a small roadside diner off Route 66. Business had been slow lately, with fewer travelers making their way down the old highway. One evening, just before closing, he flipped the open sign to closed and sat down for a quick break. It was raining hard, and he figured no one would come in at this hour. As he was cleaning up, the doorbell chimed. Frank frowned. He was sure he'd locked the door. A young woman, drenched from the rain, stood at the entrance. Her clothes were soaked through, her hair clinging to her face. "We're closed," Frank called out, but the woman didn't respond. Instead, she walked toward a booth in the back and sat down, dripping water onto the floor. Frank hesitated but approached her. "Miss, I'm sorry, but we're closed for the night." She looked up at him, her eyes hollow and empty. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Help me." Frank's stomach twisted with unease. "What's wrong?" "They're coming for me," she said, her hands shaking. They're coming, and I don't have much time. Frank glanced toward the window, but there was no one outside, just sheets of rain pouring down. Who's coming? Before she could answer, the lights in the diner flickered. The room was plunged into darkness for a split second, and when they came back on, the woman was gone. Frank looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her. Only the puddle of water remained where she had sat. As Frank stood there, confused and scared, a loud knock echoed through the diner. It came from the back door, the one that led to the kitchen. His heart racing, Frank crept toward the door. He didn't want to open it, but something compelled him to. Slowly, he reached for the knob and turned it. There was nothing outside but the rain. But when he turned back to the diner, the woman was standing there again, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered. And then, the lights went out for good.